Emergency crews in Southern California are racing to prevent a potentially catastrophic explosion after a tank holding thousands of gallons of a toxic and highly flammable chemical began overheating at an aerospace facility in Orange County. The team is bringing you some live pictures of it just there. It's very dark. You can kind of just see some water being poured on it. California Governor Gavin Newsom declared a state of emergency on Saturday as crews continue their efforts to cool and stabilize the tank. CNN's Veronica Miracle reports for us.
Well, this is a race against time, according to officials who say there are two potentially very bad outcomes that could happen here. The first being that thousands of gallons of a toxic chemical could leak out and spill into the area. The second being a catastrophic explosion. Of course, officials are trying to make sure that neither of those things happen. Fire crews have been working to spray water on the tanks to try and cool them down, but we heard from officials that apparently that hasn't been working. They say that the chemical has been increasing in temperature about a degree an hour. So at Friday morning, it was about 77 degrees, and by Saturday morning, it was about 90 degrees. Officials did talk about what could potentially happen if there was the worst case scenario explosion to happen. Take a listen to what they had to say.
So if this tank fails and we have an explosion, these represent our blast zone. The innermost circle represents areas where we can expect severe structural damage and significant harm. Beyond that, you'll see an orange oblong. That represents areas that are immediately dangerous to life and health, where it would cause injury if anybody inhales or is impacted by the product in question. And then the yellow is our non-hazardous zone, which is our odor threshold. This product has a very low odor threshold and can be smelt very easily, so that's why that representation is very large, but again, it is non-hazardous at that level.
MMA, the chemical in question, is a chemical used to manufacture plastics. And officials say smelling it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be bad for your health. However, residents in the area have apparently been reporting some issues like dizziness and other respiratory issues. It could potentially be hazardous to your health. About 15% of people in the evacuation zone actually have not left the area. They're refusing to leave. But officials say if you are outside of the evacuation red zone, then that there are no concerns to your health and that you don't even need to be wearing a mask. So that is the good news. Now, what officials are hoping will happen is that they will be able to cool the chemical enough that it will harden from the outside in, and they will be able to neutralize this issue. But there is no guarantee that that's going to happen. Of course, officials monitoring this every step of the way and communicating every step of the way. Back to you.
For more, I want to bring in Dr. Elaine Bernal, a lecturer in chemistry and biochemistry at California State University in Long Beach. Thank you so much for being with me. Can you just bring us up to speed on where things stand right now?
Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. Based on what authorities are saying and the latest developments that we're seeing, I mean, what's happening inside that tank and why are officials so concerned?
So basically what's happening is that officials are cooling the tank from the outside. So that's to control the temperature of the tank. So currently there is what's called a thermal runaway, which officials have said. So what happens is that typically in a storage tank like this, liquid methyl methacrylate is typically a monomer. And what happens is under certain conditions, those monomers will link together. So think about chains linking together, and then that becomes a reaction, and then the polymer becomes to solidify, and that creates heat. So that was the biggest concern of the officials as they were reporting today. So what's happening is as the methyl methacrylate cools from the outside in, so ideally it solidifies, and the volume that the methyl methacrylate, the MMA, takes within the tank shrinks, therefore alleviating pressure and then buying time as far as monitoring the temperature to see if there's any spikes or any other changes within the tank.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Appreciate it. Authorities do continue to focus on cooling and stabilization efforts. What exactly are they trying to achieve, and what signs would tell responders that those efforts are actually working?
So right now, authorities are looking at the trends. Again, they're looking at the spikes. They're looking if there's any leaks. Today, it was reported that there are 24 air monitors that are surrounding the area. And currently, there haven't been any reports as far as leaks, MMA leaks, contamination, pollution in the air. So those are the things to keep an eye out on.
We have heard officials and experts use the term thermal runaway. Can you explain what that means for everyone watching and why it becomes increasingly difficult to stop once that process actually starts?
So the way a thermal runaway works, so the polymerization process of MMA is what's called an exothermic reaction. So what that means is that as the reaction happens, heat is created. So that was why the biggest concern of the officials was monitoring the temperature. So that's why it's important to have the remote sensing. It's important to have to be responsive to that and to monitor that as it happens, because that is one main way to see how the reaction is proceeding is the temperature.
We are also seeing responders rely heavily on drones and remote sensing equipment too. What kinds of information are they trying to gather, and why is that technology so important?
That technology is so important because it's a way to keep track of any spikes, any trends, any changes in trends, in order to keep the first responders safe. Is it safe to keep them in there? So that's why the remote sensing is very important at this point, so that responders can react accordingly.
We are also hearing concerns around pressure building inside the tank. Can you help us to understand why that's creating such a challenge for responders?
I think it's creating such a challenge for respondents because, again, the remote sensing is important to see if the temperature is spiking or not. What happens is as the MMA cools from the outside in, there isn't really a way to see what's going on inside other than looking at the internal temperature. It's been a challenge to perhaps open the tank because that's been floated. However, doing something invasive, doing something to physically open the tank, perhaps drilling into it, can actually create sparks that can create further side reactions that are unintended and can be dangerous.
People may wonder why evacuation orders remain in place, even when officials say there isn't an active plume right now. Can you help us to explain why authorities are still taking such a cautious approach here?
I think authorities are taking such a cautious approach here because even though there is no active plume, there's some uncertainty around the tank that is actively reacting right now, and also the temperature. Again, it's important to monitor that throughout this evening and then throughout the next few days to see if it's stable, to see what the trends are. So that's why it's important for folks to evacuate and stay evacuated until the authorities clear that it's safe to come back.
Joining us now to discuss, Environmental Protection Administration Administrator Lee Zeldin, whose team is in California working to prevent a disaster. Thank you so much for joining us, Administrator Zeldin. What can you tell us about efforts to keep that tank from exploding and the air quality in the area? People are complaining that they feel sick.
So the Orange County Fire Authority is the lead agency. You have all levels of government, local, state, federal, working together. EPA has personnel on the ground, air monitors deployed in the local community. We've been involved in the modeling of different scenarios. We're being told that the tank will fail, but there are different scenarios as to what that means. The most catastrophic scenario being an explosion that results in other tanks to explode. That's the reason why you see such a big evacuation that's been done in the surrounding areas. I'm being told this morning that the most likely scenario is one of a low volume release, where the local authorities are going to be able to monitor, neutralize, and contain the threat. The Orange County Fire Authority is working to keep the temperature of the tank down. That is very important. Keeping it under 85 degrees is key. And right now, this is an emergency response. This isn't yet an environmental response, and the scale of that environmental response will be determined based off of what happens when that tank fails.